On the 14th of July, 1683, a man stood outside the walls of Vienna with more than 100,000 soldiers behind him. Inside the city were 15,000 defenders. Their emperor had already run. The suburbs were on fire, burned by Vienna's own commander, so the enemy would have nowhere to hide. Every officer in the Ottoman camp expected the order to attack. It never came. Instead, the Grand Vizier gave a different order. Dig. 2 months later, the Ottoman Empire would lose its future in Europe. And the man who gave that order would be strangled with a silk cord in Belgrade, on Christmas Day, for a decision he made in the first week. This is why he waited. 3 men decide this story. An emperor who ran, and did something on his return that Poland has not forgiven in 300 years. A merchant who walked out of a starving city into an army of 100,000. And a commander who could have won in 7 days. To understand the decision you have to understand the pressure behind it. The Ottoman Empire of 1683 was the most formidable state on earth. 3 continents. Algeria to Baghdad. Yemen to Crimea. The holy cities of Islam answered to the Sultan. For 200 years the frontier had only ever moved one way. Constantinople, 1453. The Balkans. Belgrade, 1521. Rhodes the year after. Mohacs, 1526, where a Hungarian king died in a riverbed and a kingdom died with him. 3 years later an Ottoman army reached Vienna for the first time, under the greatest sultan the dynasty ever produced, Suleiman the Magnificent. He besieged the city. He failed. He went home. And that failure sat in Ottoman memory for 154 years like an unpaid debt. Every commander who came after knew the number. Every one of them knew that whoever finally took Vienna would have done what Suleiman could not. But by 1683 the machine was tiring. Wars with Persia had drained the treasury. Rebellions flared on the frontiers. And the Janissaries, once the finest infantry in Europe, had learned they could depose a sultan whenever they disliked one. On the throne sat Mehmed IV, remembered as the hunter. He hunted. He kept to his harem. He was not especially interested in governing an empire, and everyone in Istanbul knew it. So the real power sat 1 seat lower. Kara Mustafa Pasha had been Grand Vizier for 7 years. Able, ferociously ambitious, and entirely aware that a vizier who cannot deliver is a vizier who can be replaced. What the empire needed, he decided, was a victory. A great one. And a pretext was available. Hungary had been split for a century and a half between the Sultan and the Austrian Emperor, and a long truce was expiring. In his half, the Catholic Emperor Leopold I was persecuting Protestants, and the Protestants had risen and asked the Sultan for help. It was the perfect opening, and Mehmed hesitated. So Kara Mustafa went around him. He put the case to the Janissary leadership first, a corps grown rich on war and poor on peace, and at the council, the Guard spoke for war. Then he had governors on the Hungarian frontier report that the Austrians were raiding their lands, and sent witnesses to swear it was true. Presented with a frontier apparently already in flames and an army apparently already eager, the Sultan consented. The war that ended Ottoman expansion into Europe was manufactured by the man who would be executed for losing it. What marched north that spring was among the largest armies the Ottomans ever fielded. Modern estimates run from 110,000 to 170,000 fighting men. Regiments from Anatolia and Syria. Mamluks out of Egypt. Tartar cavalry from the Crimea. And behind the fighting men, something closer to a moving city, tens of thousands of drovers, armorers and merchants, thousands. Because here is the detail most accounts skip. The Sultan had not ordered a march on Vienna. Kara Mustafa's written objective was Hungary, take the fortresses of Jor and Komarom, secure the frontier, come home. That was the campaign the Sultan approved. Deep into the march, at a council of war, he told his commanders what he actually intended. We would gain only their fortresses, and not the country itself. I wish, if Allah permits, to march on Vienna. What do you say? Nobody said anything. The silence irritated him, and he demanded to know why. The reply is one of the coldest lines in the campaign. Your task is to give orders. Ours is to carry them out. Not one of them would put his name on stopping it. So the largest army in Ottoman history changed its objective on one man's ambition. Ahead of the main army rode the Crimean Tartars, and their job was not to fight. Their job was to empty the country. Villages burned. Crops trampled. Livestock driven off. Anyone who could not reach a walled town or run west was killed, or taken and sold east. The strategy was deliberate, strip the ground so that no relief force could ever feed itself on the march. Watch the number fall. 200 kilometers. 150. 80. 40. By the second week of July, the leading Tatar horsemen were close enough that people standing on Vienna's walls at night could see the glow of burning villages on the horizon. That was the first warning most of the city got. When it became certain the army was coming for the capital, Emperor Leopold I left, and took his entire court with him. The nobility followed. The wealthy followed them. Within days Vienna was a city missing everyone who had the means to leave it. What remained was the garrison, the people who could not go, and a number who could have gone and chose not to. Hold on to Leopold. He comes back at the end of this, and how he behaves is the part people still argue about. Command of the defense fell to Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg. He had fought the Swedes, the French and the Ottomans, and he was not sentimental. He had roughly 11,500 regular troops and a hurriedly armed militia of Viennese citizens. His first order was to burn Vienna's own suburbs to the ground. Everything outside the walls that could shelter a besieger, hide a trench or feed a soldier, gone, on his instruction, before the enemy arrived. The people watching their houses burn were the people he was trying to save. Then he filled the city with powder, shot and grenades, and assigned every bastion its own men. In mid-July the army arrived, and the view from the walls was designed to break people before a shot was fired. Camel trains. Artillery parks. A camp that reached the horizon in every direction a defender could look. At its center stood Kara Mustafa's tent, a portable palace of costly fabric worked with gold, divided into chambers. In one of them, under guard, rested the banner of the Prophet. On the 14th of July the ring closed, and he sent Vienna a letter. **We have come before Vienna with such victorious armies that the earth itself can scarcely contain them. Accept Islam and be spared. Surrender the fortress without resistance, and no harm will come to anyone. And if you resist, you will be put to the sword, your homes plundered, and your children carried into captivity. Vienna did not reply. Not defiance exactly. Just silence. Which under the customs of the time meant one thing. So here is the moment the whole story turns on. He has 100,000 men and more against 15,000. He has surprise, momentum, and a garrison with no relief in sight. Every instinct says storm the walls now, while the city is frightened and alone. He does not. And the reason he does not is money. Under the customs of war he was operating in, one distinction mattered enormously. A city taken by storm belonged to the soldiers. 3 days of sack. The men who went over the wall kept what they could carry, and no power on earth could stop it once it started. A city that surrendered was something else. A city that surrendered was crown property, its treasuries, its silver, its palaces intact, all of it going to the Sultan and to the commander who delivered them. And Vienna was believed to be one of the richest cities in Europe. There is a military argument too, and it's a real one. Vienna was a modern bastion fortress, low-sloped walls that made cannonballs skip away, angular bastions covering each other with overlapping fire, ditches and outworks in front. A place like that could not simply be rushed. And he had not brought guns heavy enough to break it. So the charitable reading is that he had no choice. The uncharitable one is that he wanted the prize unbroken. Both may be true. What is not in dispute is what he chose. He sat down to a formal siege, and started the clock. The guns opened, and for weeks the mortars threw shells in high arcs over the walls and down into the streets. But artillery alone was never going to take a fortress built like that one, and he knew it. So the Ottomans began to dig. Narrow deep trenches crawling toward the walls in zigzags, angled deliberately, so the defenders could never fire straight down their length. This is the only measurement that matters for the next 2 months. Not casualties. Not assaults. Meters. 14th of July, the trenches open, 400 meters out. Late July, they reach the palisade, the outer line of heavy stakes, and the Janissaries try to take it by direct assault and are met with point-blank fire and showers of grenades. It holds, and it costs them. So they build earthen platforms in front of it, climb above it, sweep the defenders from height, drag guns up and blow the stakes apart at close range. 7th of August, the palisade falls. The trenches reach the ditch at the very foot of the walls. And there they stop digging toward Vienna, and start digging underneath it. Working by oil lamp, the miners shored their tunnels with timber and hauled the spoil out behind them. Reach the wall, pack a charge underneath it, then seal the tunnel completely, because an unsealed tunnel simply vents the blast backwards. Then light the fuse. And the Austrians were digging down to meet them. Where the tunnels broke into each other, men fought in the dark in spaces too small to stand up in, with picks and pistols pressed against bodies. On the 12th of August the Ottomans fired their first great mine, and half the city felt it move. The forward defenses went up. The Turks rushed the breach and were met with grenades, attack after attack, and thrown back. By early September every outer defense had gone, and the mines were reaching the bastions themselves. And inside, something worse than artillery had arrived. Bad water, summer heat, and unburied bodies produced an outbreak of dysentery that killed more of Vienna's defenders than the fighting did. Starhemberg himself fell ill. In the city council, the voices arguing for surrender got louder every week. Their one hope was relief, and they had no way of knowing whether relief existed. Every day Starhemberg pushed messengers out through the lines, peasants, mercenaries, volunteers. The Ottomans had thrown a double ring of outposts around the city, and anyone caught carrying a letter was tortured and executed. 12 went out in the first month. 12 died. Vienna was now a city that could not speak, being eaten by disease, with mines going in under its last wall. And then a merchant volunteered. Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki had been a Zaporozhian Cossack, had been captured by the Ottomans years earlier, and had come out of that captivity speaking Turkish so well he had no accent. He knew the songs. He knew the customs, the prayers, the manners. He now sold goods in Vienna. He and his servant Jerzy Michalowicz, who also spoke Turkish, dressed themselves as Ottoman traders. Turbans. Baskets of goods. During one of the garrison's night sorties they slipped through the walls and walked directly into the enemy camp, singing Turkish songs loudly, the way traveling merchants did. They were stopped several times. Kulczycki joked with the sentries, answered in fluent Turkish, scolded his companion for being slow, behaved, in every particular, like a man who belonged there. At one point an Ottoman officer invited the two of them to his fire and shared his pilaf, and asked where they had come from. Kulczycki named a town in Anatolia that does not exist. The officer nodded and waved them on. They walked the length of the camp and out the other side, then spent days crossing country where Austrian peasants nearly killed them both, on the reasonable grounds that they were dressed as Turks. They reached the Austrian field commander. And they came back, with the only thing the city needed. An allied army existed. It was gathering. It was coming. That army existed because of Pope Innocent XI, who spent the year doing the one thing nobody else in Europe could, getting Christian rulers who despised each other to sign something. That spring he brokered the agreement that mattered: if the Turks besieged Vienna, Poland would march. And Poland's king was Jan III Sobieski, who 10 years earlier at Kotin had destroyed an Ottoman army so completely that the nobility elected him king for it. Watch them come together. German princes from the west, Saxons, Bavarians, contingents from the southern states. The imperial forces under Charles of Lorraine. And from the east, Sobieski at the head of the Polish army. They meet on the Danube, build a bridge, and cross into a single force of roughly 70,000 men with 18,000 cavalry inside it. Then Sobieski takes them the way nobody expects, straight through the Vienna woods. The last outliers of the Alps. Hills several hundred meters high, cut by ravines, thick with forest, and the autumn rain has started. Cannon hauled by hand on ropes, lowered into ravines and dragged up the far side. The army crawls. And every night a signal rocket goes up over Vienna, and nobody in those woods can see it yet. And nobody in those woods could see how little was left. Because Vienna was nearly finished. On the 2nd of September a mine brought down part of a bastion wall for the first time. On the 6th, they nearly ended it. A section of wall went down and the Janissaries almost got into the city. Starhemberg led the counterattack himself. The gap was about 9 meters wide, narrow enough that Ottoman numbers stopped mattering. When the guns were finally dragged up and loaded with iron and lead shot, grapeshot went through the assault columns at point-blank range. Hundreds of defenders died holding that gap. Starhemberg's men were collapsing asleep at their posts, so he issued a decree that anyone found sleeping on guard would be executed. Powder was running short. Of the garrison that started, only about a third were still fit to fight. And under one breach the Ottomans were packing barrel after barrel of powder into a chamber for one final, enormous mine. One blast, and the army pours in. At dawn on the 12th of September a rocket went up, not from the cathedral. From the hills. The cry went along the walls. Relief. Relief has come. And on the slopes above the Ottoman camp, regiment after regiment, banner after banner, an army unfolded in the morning light. Kara Mustafa had never believed a large army could be brought through those ravines. He had not blocked the passes. He had not fortified his rear. Whatever you make of his decision in July, this is the era nobody defends. He now had to turn an entire army around, in place, with an enemy above him. He left his best infantry, the Janissaries, in the trenches to finish the city, and swung the rest uphill. Now watch the ground, because the ground is what decides this. The Allies come off the heights in two wings. On the left, the Austrians, Saxons, Bavarians, and Franconians go in first, counterattacked hard, and barely hold. On the right, the Poles are still dragging themselves out of the forest. They drew the worst ground and they are late. But by mid-morning the Allied guns are on the ridge, and from there they are firing downward into a camp. Step by step the Ottomans are pushed off the high ground, and by evening the fighting has rolled out onto open ground in front of the tents. Which is the one thing Kara Mustafa needed never to happen. By evening the fighting had rolled onto open slopes, and that was what Sobieski had been waiting for. The winged Hussars were heavy cavalry in an age that had abandoned heavy cavalry, everyone else had gone lighter. The Poles had an 5-meter lances, longer than anything they would meet. Gilded cuirasses. Leopard and wolf skins over the armor. And behind the shoulders, the wings, which hummed in the air at the charge. Around 6 in the evening, nearly 18,000 horsemen formed up across the slope, the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. Sobieski rode at the head of his own hussars. Lances came down. And the whole hillside began to move. The Ottomans got off one cannon volley and a few musket volleys, and then the lances arrived at full gallop and went straight through the line. Kara Mustafa threw in his reserves and went in himself with his saber drawn. Most of his escort was cut down around him and his own servants dragged him out by force. And under the walls, the great mine never fired, the defenders had broken into the chamber and collapsed the gallery. The Janissaries surged into the breaches one last time. And then the waves simply stopped. The retreat had been ordered. The Ottomans ran so fast they left the wall behind them. Roughly 150 cannon. The powder. The provisions. The livestock. The tents, still standing. By nightfall the defenders of Vienna were walking through an abandoned city of silk, and they had never seen anything like it. And we know what it looked like, because the next day Jan Sobieski sat down inside Kara Mustafa's own tent and wrote to his wife. He left me heir to his tent and riches. He describes parrots and birds of paradise. Ostriches, which the Grand Vizier had killed rather than let fall into enemy hands. Our soldiers, and the burghers of Vienna, were 2 whole nights and 1 day in rifling their tents. And he thought a week would not finish the job. Then, near the end of that letter, Sobieski writes one line that tells you more about European politics than the whole battle does. I have sent several dispatches to foreign princes to give notice of this action and then, flatly, but the King of France was forgotten. Louis XIV had spent years quietly encouraging Ottoman pressure on the Habsburgs, because anything that weakened Vienna strengthened Paris. He had sent nothing. Sobieski knew. And that is how a king says it. Days later Leopold came back to the city he had left. Starhemberg had met Sobieski at the gates and called him his deliverer. The people had reached out in the street to touch his clothes. The emperor's meeting with him was correct, formal, and freezing, because Leopold understood that Europe was about to credit the saving of Vienna to a Polish king, and not to himself. Kara Mustafa fled east, looked for people to blame, and executed several of his own commanders. It bought him 3 months. On the 25th of December, 1683, messengers from the Sultan reached him in Belgrade and read out his death sentence. He washed. He prayed. A silk cord went round his neck and 2 men pulled it from either end, a bloodless death, the courtesy owed a man of his rank. His head went to the Sultan in a velvet bag. He was executed for losing a battle on the 12th of September. He did not lose it on the 12th of September. He lost it on the 14th of July, standing in front of a city he could have taken in a week, deciding that he wanted it undamaged. Now, there are 2 things everyone knows about the Siege of Vienna. That the city's bakers celebrated by baking pastries shaped like the Ottoman crescent, so Vienna could eat its enemy every morning, and that this is where the croissant comes from. And that Kalksiki was rewarded with the sacks of strange dark beans left behind in the camp, and opened Europe's first coffee house. Neither is true. The crescent-shaped kipfel appears in written records centuries before 1683. And Vienna's first coffee house was opened in 1685 by an Armenian named Johannes Diodato. Kalksikis came a year after that. Most of the Kalksiki stories were written down by a man called Gottfried Jülich, in 1783. The 100th anniversary. The legend was not handed down from the siege at all. It was written to order, on schedule, for the centenary of a battle nobody alive could remember. Which is a shame, because the real man did not need it. He put on a turban and walked out of a starving city into an army of 100,000 men. He sang their songs. He ate at their fire. He told an officer he came from a town that does not exist. And then he walked out the other side, and came back, and told 15,000 people to keep fighting. You do not need to invent a coffee house for a man who did that. Half of what most people know about this siege was written a century after it ended. Working out which half is most of what this channel does. Subscribe.